In the wake of depositors and corporations pulling their money out of Citigroup and other major U.S. banks, Lyndon LaRouche was recently presented with a number of questions. Many businesses and other large depositors are now panicked that their bank will fold in on itself and swallow up their deposits, ranging in the hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars, whereas under current arrangements, they would only be insured by the FDIC up to about $250,000. The question was posed to LaRouche whether he would endorse lifting the ceiling on the amount the FDIC insures on legitimate bank deposits. LaRouche responded that the power to do that was already implicit in the Homeowners and Bank Protection Act, which says specifically that the federal and state chartered banks shall be protected so they can resume the traditional functions serving local communities and facilitating credit for investment in productive industries, agriculture, infrastructure, etc. That means that the deposits of these depositors and legitimate businesses are protected. Period. The second question was, what do we do in light of the fact that the amount of money the government has used to bail out leading financial institutions like AIG, Citigroup, and GM exceed by a long shot the total listed value of the company? So in essence, these institutions have been bought by the federal government. LaRouche announced that a new element has to be introduced to the recovery process at this time. That is, Alexander Hamilton's concept of the national bank. By the end of the Revolutionary War, each of the states were saddled with enormous and disproportionate trade and war debts. They and the Continental Congress fought over how to deal with it. How would the indebted states levy enough taxes and still build up their fledgling industry? How long would the foreign loans continue coming into the Continental Congress to bail out the states before the private money decided to turn against the nation? The situation, in light of the commitment established with the Declaration of Independence, was somewhat absurd. As aide-de-camp to General Washington, Alexander Hamilton saw early on that the great threat of national dissolution came from not having the means to fulfill the purpose of the Declaration of Independence. That as free and independent states, they have full power to do all acts and things which independent states may of right do. That is, namely, the right to organize for the benefit of the people of the nation, a national economy, and all that entails. Writing from 1779 to 1782, Hamilton declared that a federal government without a general power of taxation and the regulation of trade could have no credit or credibility. By the end of the war in 1783, the nation was still undecided, and the Continental Congress was fighting amongst themselves over whether we would have a nation or a confederation, and to what extent a federal government could act to take broad and sweeping actions necessary to build a federal republic. Alexander Hamilton saw that the Articles of Confederation were doomed to fail without the powers given to the federal government to administer as a federal government, and he wrote that every power vested in a government is in its nature sovereign, and includes by force of term a right to employ all the means requisite and fairly applicable to the attainment of the ends of such power. Of course, two things were crucial to attain the ends of the power of the U.S. Republic. First and foremost, the establishment of the federal government, entrusted with the means to execute the principal ends established in our Declaration of Independence. Secondly, we required an institution by which the federal government could guide the progress of the nation and the national economy, to safeguard the people of the states against attacks from abroad, and increase their freedom as citizens to command their own economic destiny and improve their and future generations' conditions of life. Hamilton fought for these powers over the course of a decade, culminating in the Constitutional Convention, where Congress was given the power they should still enjoy today to protect and improve the nation, to establish and control a uniform set of taxes and protective tariffs, to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to determine the value of its own money and provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and coin of the United States. At the time, the last thing that was expected from the newly formed states was that we would break a long-established historic rank and file, typified by the Venetian banking system and its successor, the British Empire. Under that system, the price for using money and the value of money itself was determined arbitrarily by a private bank, like the private central banks of today, which we have tolerated for far too long. That Hamilton put into law that the nation itself was to determine its economic destiny, the value and coining of its money, and issuance of credit by the nation, was a mighty and highly unexpected blow to the British Empire, and Alexander Hamilton knew it. So in that post-war period, Hamilton proposed something which today's typical economist or accountant or incompetent would probably lose their shirt over. We would take on a national debt as a national blessing. Rather than each state trying to individually stake its claim over taxes and revenues to pay off its own debt, the debts of the state were to be joined together under the constitutional power of the newly established government. The government was to take responsibility for those legitimate debts incurred by the states in legitimate trade and war expenses. Those debts were important, and we would honor and uphold our promise to pay them back as a single nation, not a confederation of states. Taking on this debt required the initiation of the powers of Article 1, Section 8, and with them a true national economy. So we took the debt onto our books, so to speak, and we monetized that debt. We said that the U.S. promise to pay was as good as the money itself. That debt then formed, in part, the base on which we recapitalized the private chartered banks of the country. The other part of the startup capital was invested by private shareholders, whose money was equally as valuable as the public debt. In taking on such a great debt, as we know all too well today, we keep in mind that not all debts are created equal. That new capital into our banking system was a stock from which new loans could be and were leveraged. Under Hamilton, the new loans, or credit, at low rates, were an essential part of a national plan to expand investment in the physical productive base of our economy. And so, we were to build our way out of debt, which included increasing the circulation of credit in the process. This was the creation of the first U.S. national bank, a privately owned, federally chartered bank under the authority of the federal government. Under the constitutional provision that the Congress utters credit, that credit had to be issued from somewhere, where, under the regulation of the government, it could be put to active good use. That credit must be put to activity which first is of the type which would aid in the retirement of the debt, but, most importantly, it would be issued with preference to those activities to strengthen the nation and the ability of the citizens of the nation to contribute to the betterment of their lives and the lives of those of generations after them. This commitment has traditionally taken the form of a physical investment into the nation's future, a physical investment in the economic foundations on which all prosperity and innovation can then be leveraged, and that continuing process of investment and improvement in the people's livelihood over the course of generations is the ends to which the national bank is a means. This, in brief, is a model for what must be done today. The obligations of legitimate corporations and depositors will be held as assets of a new national bank until they are ready to become private entities again. LaRouche recently stated, quote, "A Hamiltonian National Banking Act is needed. After we've written off all of the trash on the books of the bank, beginning with the derivatives, there will still be legitimate obligations on their books to the federal government," end quote. Those will represent net assets on the books of the national bank until they are retired. So what we need is a National Banking Reform Act to provide for these kinds of circumstances of receivership. Write off the trash on the books, and then sort out the still existing legitimate obligations and put them on the balance sheets of a federal government entity, a national bank, which can issue credit against them until they are retired.